pandemic has affected most of our daily lives. It's reshaped much of the political terrain. Tom touched a bit on that, including campaigning, and I expect most importantly, voting. And here's what I mean. Every election is a referendum on the incumbent. Now, Trump has never cracked the 50% ceiling in voter approval. And that was even before the virus hit. But he planned to go around and boast, and he could boast about his economic achievements. To do so, he needed to restart those patented mega rallies, if you will. It's not so coincidentally gave him access to a significant of so-called free media news coverage. And we now know how important that free media is to a campaign that's simply running on fumes financially right now. Enter the coronavirus, and the election is now a referendum on the coronavirus and the incumbent. When Trump tested positive for Corona-19, he was sort of pulled off the campaign trail, and the candidate lost valuable time and, again, valuable media coverage to defend himself and his administration and the administration's approach to the virus. His own personal diagnosis also took some sting out of the Republicans' argument that the reason that Joe Biden was hiding in his basement had nothing to do with health concerns, COVID concerns, if you will, but it was because, quote, he was at the onset of dementia, end quote. That wasn't doing so well as an attack anymore. Then the COVID began clobbering red states as well as blue states, destabilizing Trump's argument that the real political villains were mostly Democratic governors and local leaders. Okay, now, we won't go into the antics of the stock market and what they have done because it keeps going like this and like that. We can talk about it a little later on, as you may have heard. We had a horrible day yesterday on the stock market. Today, the numbers and the economic numbers indicate that we are on our way sort of out of it. So he may have muted that possible attack. All of this happening has allowed the media and the Biden campaign to focus on Trump's greatest political liability, the pandemic, at a time when well over a majority of voters believe that Trump isn't handling the pandemic very well, and they are showing more trust in Joe Biden. And on the minds of most Americans right now, the pandemic is the most important concern. Well, that sure doesn't bode very well for an incumbent president who's already trailing in many of the head-to-head polls. Now, briefly, COVID-19 is not only an albatross around the president's neck, it's impacting the political fortunes of those Washington folk, particularly Republican senators in competitive states, and there are far more of them than there are Democrats who are threatened in competitive states. I couldn't go on, and I will when we get to talk about some examples of that. I'll be happy to discuss whatever with you down the line. Suffice it to say, for now, that for me at least, it looks like the coronavirus has reshaped the presidential campaign, transforming media coverage, the debates, the conventions, the way candidates campaign and communicate, and how voters make their voices heard and how they cast their ballot. Will all of this have a lasting impact on campaigning up and down the ballot, on the political life and the political culture of our state and of our nation? Tuesday is going to give us a clue. as to what our new political normal may look like, but it's only a clue. We do live in interesting times, and that's all I'll say for now.
Well, I think we're done today. Thank you all so much for joining. No. Thanks, Sherry. Ken,
Yes.
why don't you share what you're thinking about? What's on your mind today?
Yeah, thanks. I'm an academic, and so for me, this is a feast time to be an observer. I don't have to be up late working on a campaign or anything like that. But as an academic, this is a fascinating election. I study state politics in particular, and California politics is my real specialization. I'm the Associate Director of the Rose Institute of State and Local Government at Claremont McKenna College, and that institute is really focused on state politics. And over the course of the last generation, and especially the last decade, California has become overwhelmingly a blue state. And so there's actually no suspense in California about who's going to win California's electoral votes. Hillary Clinton won by 4 million votes 4 years ago, and Joe Biden will probably do better this time around. So, and the state legislative races and congressional races, there might be some changes at the margin, but there are already big Democratic supermajorities there. So really the main suspense for us in California at the state level are the ballot measures. And there's some really important ones that we can talk about later on in our call here. And so at the Rose Institute, I'll put in a little pitch for this. Our students put together short videos that analyze in a nonpartisan way all 12 of the statewide ballot measures. And so if you haven't already voted, or if you know people who haven't, you can go online to roseinstitute.org and take a look at that student. It's really high quality student analysis of those ballot measures. The other thing that I'm looking at this year in particular are other states around the country who are moving, potentially. In 2016, it was very interesting to see some states that had been Democratic states vote for Trump. This time around, there's some states that have been Republican states that are in play for Democrats. You can look at Arizona, at Georgia, some other places. And the one that I'm particularly interested in is the state of Texas, which has been voting for Republican presidential candidates ever since 1980. Jimmy Carter was the last presidential candidate to win in Texas. And Trump won by 9 points 4 years ago, and now it's seen as a dead heat. And down ballot in Texas as well, there are many more competitive races. And so we might talk, I plan to talk a little bit later today about the comparison between California and Texas in this year's election.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ken. Mindy, good morning, and thank you for being here today. What are you thinking about as we head towards Tuesday?
A lot. And I'm an academic as well, but I am staying up late doing current research, which I'm sure you are as well, Ken, and just following and tracking everything. So I'm on faculty at the USC Price School of Public Policy, which you already mentioned, and found and direct my research center called the Center for Inclusive Democracy. Some folks out there may know us as the California Civic Engagement Project. We just rebranded a couple of months ago, just to better reflect the scope of our work and our relationships around the country. So if we're putting in plugs, I want to talk about just where we're at right now in terms of the number of ballots. But for those of you in LA County, my center just launched the LA Early Ballot Count Tool. So you can go to our website, cid.usc.edu, and you'll find it there. We have a citing tool that's national, which is a different kind of tool. It's about suggesting voting locations, but you'll look for the LA County with the name in the title, ballot tool, and it is tracking the early vote here in LA County by vote by mail broken out by Dropbox and USPS, and also all the early vote count. And you can look at it by vote center in terms of the volume at the center, but also at your neighborhood precinct. So the idea is to inform both the registrar's office as well as advocacy groups, community groups, in terms of, where are the areas that are high turnout, where are the areas that are low turnout, to ultimately help plan with, strategic staffing and avoiding lines and helping to get outreach. So get outreach going, I should say. So what's on my mind are those big numbers. So first off, in California, we're at about 8.5 million ballots already returned of all types, coming in, depending on how they were submitted. Of course, we have over 21 million registered voters that all received a ballot this year because of COVID, right? We're one of the few states that are doing that, mailing a vote by mail ballot to everyone. But we're seeing the tremendous numbers that are outpacing, threefold so far what we saw in 2016. We are expecting very good year for turnout for the first few days and first week or two of these early returns, if you will. I and others were saying, I'm sure, I imagine my colleague here colleagues on the Zoom probably agree. We were suggesting caution in terms of interpreting that into any sort of turnout number, because the numbers were big, but it was clearly from voters who were already going to vote or very highly likely to vote anyway, and they just voted early, and we didn't know if that trend would continue, and essentially things were kind of being front loaded, and what would it actually mean for turnout in the end overall. We still don't really fully know, obviously, what turnout will be, but I think we're looking at an incredibly good year for turnout. And of course, across the country now, we're seeing 75 million plus ballots. About 50 of them, those are vote by mail ballots, 50 million, are vote by mail ballots. We're seeing in some states, particularly swing states, some, I don't know if you want to call it surging yet, but certainly blowing past the 2016 numbers. That's really exciting. We still don't quite know what this is going to mean for historically underrepresented groups. We're seeing some numbers across the country that look like it's really positive for young people. Here in California, where I think it's still out in terms of young people are picking up the pace, but still being outpaced by older voters, which we typically expect. But we don't know if this is going to be the year for youth turnout in California. We'll have to see, as well as the Latino vote and Asian American vote. So some exciting numbers, but still a long way to go. But I think the other kind of set of things that are on my mind are just, what's fueling all of this, and where are the voters? So we've talked about campaigns, but where are the voters at right now? I think there are three factors that have been since, ballots first could be returned here, at least in California, three things that are fueling these huge early numbers. One is we have many more vote by mail ballots out there that can be returned early, right? That doesn't make up those additional vote by mail ballots that are out there, at least in our state, don't make up, obviously, don't explain away fully all of the huge numbers that we're getting, but that has helped. I think we're seeing, because of COVID, we know voters have concerns about safety with COVID, and also in terms of trust around the USPS and all the rhetoric around the USPS and actual concerns that we've seen in terms of delivery times. So voters are wanting to use those vote by mail ballots to get it in and make sure that it's in safely and they don't have to worry about it. And many, of course, are by Dropbox, not by mail. And thirdly, I think that we are seeing a huge show of enthusiasm. And it might be, and I think the word was used earlier, it might be that voters are just excited at this point. Again, remember, these are mostly at least still diehard voters. So that are, presumably to some degree have been following politics for the last 4 years, right? And recently, and that many of them are voting early because they want to feel a sense of relief, right? Show that they've actually voted. Why wait? I want to finally cast my ballot. I've been waiting for 2 years. I've been waiting for 4 years, especially in a blue state like California, but I think across the country. So at the same time, what's also on my mind, and maybe I'll just end here, is that we, of course, can't lose track of the fact that there has been some real damage done to trust in our electoral system. And I'm not even talking about those that have concerns about 2016 or Trump and his rhetoric and those sorts of things. I'm talking about just even in the last couple of months, the claims unfortunately, by President Trump and others, but not just him, the claims around voter fraud and vote by mail, which of course are completely false. The concerns around USPS, the concerns, unfortunately, in a state like California, we recently, of course, had lots of news coverage that went national around illegal drop boxes, or at least the legal battle that we're seeing now around the legality of those drop boxes. All of that just serves, right, to make voters who maybe previously were comfortable, right, like diehard, longtime vote by mail voters, even wonder if they should be using vote by mail. And overall, it can serve to hurt confidence in this election. We are deeply concerned about post-November 3rd and what all the legal challenges and rhetoric that we're going to hear there is going to mean for voter confidence. Of course, what it actually can mean for our democratic process. And I think we're going to have we're going to see some difficult road post-November 3rd to get to a decision in terms of who actually legally won the presidency. But aside from the presidency, we need trust in our electoral system, period. And I'm concerned that we have real damage going forward. People may be voting now because they feel incredibly motivated, but what will linger when the candidates change, well, I fear what will linger will be the distrust and the question marks around how we vote, how votes are counted, trust in the administration of elections and the review of elections afterwards as well. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Mindy. And I'm going to open it up for Matt to share his thoughts, but also wanted to just share with the group. As you're hearing these very insightful thoughts from our panelists, please be sure to, if you have a question you'd like to share, please feel free to enter it into the chat for those of you that are on the Zoom direct link. And I think if you're going through the webinar function of our meeting software program, I think there might be an opportunity for you to enter questions in there as well. So now I'm going to ask Matt Klink to give us his thoughts on and his opening statements. And then from there, we're going to go directly into some questions of our panelists. So Matt? And Matt, you're on the mute bingo.
No, inevitably it happens. One idiot does it on every call, and today that's me. So let me, I'll be brief because I think it'd be more fun to engage with the panelists on this. I think that election day is going to be anticlimactic. We're not going to know in many cases who won. And I can remember I was at a Sacramento forum probably 2 years ago at this point, and a columnist who I shall not name, but who publishes something at around the lunchtime hour, talked about talked about what a great thing it was that we were taking the time to get our elections right. And I raised my hand and asked a question, and I go, you're telling us it's a win that we don't know who wins on election day? And I think that it's going to be a major problem. And I also think that, look, California, we have our act together on absentee ballot voting. We've been doing it for a long time. We still make mistakes, but our mistakes are going to pale in comparison to the rushed nature of other states trying to figure out how to not only send, but gather absentee ballots and count them. I mean, you have examples of states where, you know, if you apply for an absentee ballot, but you show up at your precinct to vote, you're automatically given a provisional ballot. And then you have to wait to the ballot's going to have to be verified. It's going to create some huge nightmares. You know, in Pennsylvania, if you don't put your ballot in the privacy envelope, it must not be counted. It's termed a naked ballot and thrown out. So, I mean, you have all these random rules that are going to trip up first-time voters who are not familiar with the absentee ballot voting procedures. So I think it's going to create a whole hot mess. And I have been saying for a couple months that, you know, the Full Employment Act for election law attorneys will commence on November the 3rd as they're rushing to probably 5, maybe 6 states. What else? I think that it's fascinating that Donald Trump in general, because he's kind of the everybody's focusing on that. But right, Sherry, as you said, there are a lot of really important Senate races that deserve some talking about, given that the Senate could flip very easily. Donald Trump's numbers are frozen. He's never moved beyond where he is. Unlike with Hillary, where it was kind of a little bit of an EKG machine going up and down, Donald Trump's numbers have never moved with Joe Biden. And I think in a large part, people generally like Joe Biden. He's not controversial like Hillary Clinton was. I mean, the joke that I've heard people make is that, you know, Donald Trump was the second most unpopular politician in 2016, but the Democrats nominated the first most unpopular politician in 2016. That's just not Joe Biden. He has many flaws, but he is I think genuinely his heart is in the right place. He is a nice guy who respects people and treats people well. Donald Trump is as likely to lose Arizona, Georgia, and Texas as he is likely to win Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, or Michigan, which makes for a very tough election day. Now, there are some positives here. I mean, Gallup is out with the number that says 56% of Americans think that they're better off now than they were 4 years ago, which I was flabbergasted when I heard that number. The economy in the third quarter grew at 33.1%. But it doesn't matter because, as Sherry pointed out, the third candidate in this presidential race is a virus named COVID-19, and it has linked itself on a positive side to Joe Biden's campaign. And no matter what Trump says about saying what he has done, which people don't believe, or what Joe Biden would have done, which frankly, who cares, because nobody can prove it. It is weighing Trump down significantly. And then last but not least, I'll talk quickly about polling. The pollsters, they, believe it or not, they largely got it right in 2016. They just missed a couple of key states. Unfortunately, those were the states that decided the election. They were right in 2018. And if you look at the polling for 2020, with a few outlier polls, the race is, it does not look good for Donald Trump across the board. The numbers, I think, will be closer because I do believe that there is the term is the shy Trump voter. I think that's a horrible name for them because they're probably not very shy. But that being said, I think that Joe Biden is up in all of the key states that he needs. And he feels comfortable enough going to places where he thinks he can eke out a win. I will say regarding Texas, I think the Texans don't like New Yorkers. I always think back to the Pace Picante ad where they say, New York City, cookie, get a rope. And I think that they don't like Donald Trump, but they're not anti-Republican. They're just anti-Donald Trump. So with that, let's turn it back over to you, Lisa, and let's take it away.
Well, thank you so much. So remember, if you have any questions, please be sure to add them into the chat or into the Pathable system. Let's talk first about this idea of disinformation in this campaign. And I'm particularly interested in thoughts. Maybe we'll start with you, Matt. But I'm really curious about outside interference in the election and in the campaigns. I think we even saw some news yesterday where there were some additional concerns about outside interference in the election process. I was listening to some folks at Google talk about the security concerns that they're seeing. We had some public hearings in Congress about the role that the social media platforms are playing in the campaigns and concern about disinformation from all sides. So how big of a role is this disinformation, this campaign interference? How much is it really playing in this election?
I don't think it's that big of, it's clearly a factor, but it is not going to ultimately be a deciding factor. I think that part of the problem is that there is just so much content out there right now that it is incredibly difficult to decide what's real and what's not. And even the content that's real, is it accurate or is it not? If you listened at all to that hearing on Capitol Hill yesterday, Google, Facebook, and Twitter, they're in it pretty deep, and they're in they have some big problems. And it's not just with Republicans. I think that Democrats have some issues with them as well. But look, there is content that comes from Russia, from China, from Iran. That happened before 2016, and it will probably continue. There is so much random stuff out there. But the larger problem, frankly, is you can configure your newsfeed to only get stuff that you believe in. And that creates more problems for the electorate than anything. I mean, if all you watch is Fox News, you got a pretty screwed up view of reality. And
I know, Matt, I've been meaning to talk to you about that.
No, I forced myself to rotate around, actually. But no, I mean, I also believe you should read to watch news at a 3-to-1 ratio. So you try to read more, but no, you the whole beauty of our system is that yes, Sherry. What?
If you want to read more than watch, where do you send us to read?
Oh.
Certainly Facebook and Twitter.
No. Well, look, Politico, their free content is awesome. Their paid content is even better via subscription. Axios is really good. Real Clear Politics, I love. And the stuff in California that they've got. I mean, Political California's newsletter is amazing. I love to look at what is it? Oh God, now I'm going to miss it. But I read articles in the New York Times. I love the Wall Street Journal. I read the LA Times. It would be great if they had a business columnist that was actually a business friendly columnist. But no, look, there's so much that's good out there. But if you read the crap that comes across from some of these interest groups, your vision of what, you would think that, that Joe Biden files down the nubs of his horns before he goes on TV. I mean, it doesn't help. And it's so easy for anybody to publish a credible looking publication that voters need to take a little bit, just a smidgen of time to find a couple places that they trust. And I got to tell you, the news media, the New York Times and others are not helping themselves out. They screw up this whole thing with the quote unquote anonymous op-ed that they published from a senior White House official that turns out was not very senior and was not a White House official. So, I mean, that's just the most recent example. So I'll turn it back. Sherry, I know you've got some thoughts on this because I've heard you talk about it before.
Well, yeah, and I probably feel much more than you do that this outside interference does take its toll. And it began a long time ago when people put blinders on and all they will do is go to blogs, to websites that agree with their perspective on the world, or will adopt a perspective of that blog, which may well be false, which may well be, as Matt described it, just bogus as all get out. And I worry. I don't see, well, I do see that impacting voters in this election. I don't know how much it will impact, but it will have a role in voters' equations. And I think that's terrifically unhealthy. And I don't think that our leaders, that has been politicized to the partisanship that it just inundates everything in our lives, has done the same for the debate over foreign interference. And we need some leadership that will simply say, we're going to take a look at this. We're going to see what the real impact is. And if it is as negative as I think, we're going to try to do something about it.
Thank you, Sherry.
Wait, one more point. We have to always remember that there is the First Amendment, and that makes it difficult.
Lisa,
thanks, Sherry. Mindy, I was actually going to turn to you. So please do add your thoughts here, but I also want to talk about the role of women in the election. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on what role you think women are going to play, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this interference topic as well.
Sure. Well, in terms of interference, and I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't be taking it seriously. The role of foreign interference, I think, is something that that played a role to some degree in 2016. We'll never fully know. But I'm not a member of the U.S. intelligence community, so I personally have no idea exactly how extensive it is. I think we've heard enough to say that it's continuing. It will continue beyond 2020 as well. Countries like Russia, like China, like Iran. And it's because there's a political, an economic motive, right, for those countries. But what I would just emphasize is I think that the misinformation that we have in this country that is home generated, right, and some of it definitely intertwines, but that is a far greater threat. When we hear the president of the United States with the power of the media and the bully pulpit, right, giving information that is false. When we hear other leaders, civic, elected, that for political purposes, or it always happens in a campaign where there's some twisting of the truth, of course, right? Fact checking always has been needed, but when we don't see leaders standing up against misinformation and letting it stand for all kinds of calculations that they're making behind the scenes, it's incredibly damaging. And we've had a cumulative effect over the last few years to, as Matt said, when you get something from what we think is a trusted source, you still have to, that's real, then you still have to wonder if it's even accurate. And the challenges I can't think of the exact word right now, but the challenges made to the media by the president and others as well. And by the way, also from progressives and liberals to the right-wing media, right? It kind of goes all directions. To be a journalist doesn't mean the same thing anymore. What is a trusted media source, I would argue, is in question around the circle of options that we have. And we just have to take that incredibly seriously. And I'll leave it there. Oh, and you asked me about women. Just a small point. You always get this question at every election. So, women vote more than men. Women have higher turnout rates by usually 3, 4, 5 percentage points, depending on the election. If you look within the women's vote, though, there are disparities within the women's vote. So women of color vote generally more than men of color, particularly African-American women and Latinas. Younger women of color vote even more than younger men of color. But within the women's vote, there's still a lot of disparity. So white women vote much more, higher rates than Black women, and particularly Latinas and Asian American women and so forth. So saying all that, the women, at least certainly white women, have a lot of sway and a lot of influence in the electorate. It doesn't mean that they're getting the messages and information that they need fully. I feel like I'm harping on the president, but just because this example just popped in because it was made headlines. Just the other day, the president telling women that he was going to get their husband's jobs back. So, but a lot of candidates make missteps, period. I'm both Democrat and Republican and otherwise, in trying to figure out the women's vote, which is absolutely insane that we're still trying to figure out the women's vote. I could just leave it there. So women have influence, certainly, but it doesn't mean, just as in many other sectors in our society, it doesn't mean that we are getting the policy preferences and policy needs that we have met. And we look at those that are in power, actually elected positions. Women are much, in Congress, for instance, much underrepresented, right, compared to their numbers in the population. So there's this disconnect between women's power at the ballot box and actually seeing representation amongst those that make decisions, and then actually amongst the policies that are discussed and how they're decided. And I'd say that, by the way, regardless of your policy, what either party, right? Women can say that. So.
Well, thank you. I think that's very insightful. We've spent some time at the national level, and I want to turn to California, some of the ballot initiatives. So, Tom and Ken, both of you are, a lot of focus on what's happening with the California initiatives. What do you think? Are there going to be any surprises? We've got the overturn of 209. We've got potential to start to mess with the holy grail of California politics, Prop 13. What do we think we're going to see? And maybe I'll start with you, Tom, and Ken, you can add in. What do you think we're going to see as a result of November 3rd election day?
Lisa, I appreciate that question. I kind of want to clean up a couple of the misinformation thing, like the misinformation discussion, just because I think it's so topical. And I guess I would ask people to do a couple of things. I think Klink hit on this really well, which is challenge yourself to read content that is counter to your biases. We all have been brought up. We all have these inherent biases for how we were brought up, how we've lived our lives. Challenge yourself to read content that isn't in your wheelhouse. It's hard for everybody. It's hard. You got to find it though. And then the other thing, and I thought it was really interesting, Mindy, I think you hit on it really well, which was, yes, there's a misinformation, but what's happening in the state and what happens here. And I think one of the biggest mistakes this legislature made was allowing for ballot harvesting, period. And there's an uprising without a chain of custody. There's no chain of custody from the day someone gives a ballot to someone and where it actually gets delivered. And that happened in 2018 also. And I saw all kinds of ring doorbells of people going door to door asking for ballots. And then, I find it as bias though in the media. Again, I'm not a real big conspiracy theorist usually, but the bias in the media is, oh, the Republicans did it. Oh my gosh, look at all this. And so I find there wasn't the uprising in 2018. This is where, I'll put my hat on. This is where us Republicans start to get a little bit like, oh yeah, it's us doing it. So now it's a problem, right? And so, I challenge people to be thinking about these problems, even when it's not happening at the different levels. So just a couple of things on that. As far as ballot measures, Lisa, we're really, with these turnout numbers, and Mindy hit this, we've got 22 million registered voters. And we've got historical turnout would be 75%. If you just take the last 6, you got 75%. We're going to be up in the mid 80s. We're going to be 82 to 85%. But add into that, we have more voters registered than ever before. We're adding 1.5 million voters just this year. So these turnout numbers are huge. And Klink's excited because you know what that means? That means there's more voter contact and people have to spend more money. So as a political consultant, he's going, all right, this means more money for us. But you're right. There's some just some paramount, I think, and since this is a business conference, I think there's some key measures to talk about. I'll let Matt or others talk. We obviously have the Prop 15 measure, but globally, I want to talk about the business community and what you've seen over the past few election cycles as it relates to these ballot measures. If your business interest is at risk, you will spend whatever it takes to make sure you can pass or defeat a ballot measure. Right? You're seeing Uber, Lyft, Postmates, et cetera, bless them. They're protecting their business interests. They're spending $200 million to do that. You've seen the same thing. That's not the first time. You see the dialysis industry do that. You see the multifamily housing industry do that this year and last year. You saw the ambulance industry do that 2 years ago with a measure on workplace requirements. If it's zeroed in, these industries will spend whatever it takes to win. What I'm concerned about as it relates to these ballot measures, though, is when you look at the broad business community, is there's big picture topics. You can take Uber, Lyft. That's a whole issue of independent contracting. And there's a carve out for Uber, Lyft, and great for Uber, Lyft and the app folks. But what about the rest of the business industry? There's 150 panelists on here. My guess is if they're all in they're all in business, they all use independent contractors at some level. And this is a huge problem, right? You have the same issue with the minimum wage discussion, and the business community really needs to come together. And I give a lot of credit to Stuart and the team. They really need to come together to fight these broader topics, and Prop 15 is probably one of the biggest ones, which is the rollback of Prop 13 and the split roll. And the business communities come together on that one because it impacts a broad base. They've raised $70 million to defeat this measure. I got to tell you, it hasn't been easy. Klink's on the campaign. I'm on the campaign. It's not an easy thing. COVID hit, et cetera. But there's other topics that are out there that I think impact the business community, and they've got to find a way to come together. Before this, the last time the business community did this was Prop 26, which was the right to vote on taxes. Prop 26. And before that, there was the a lawsuit abuse measure. But you've got PAGA issues. You've got lots of things that are impacting the business community, and they can't get it together because they're not directly impacting one industry. So that's kind of big picture. You know, if anyone has questions, I think Prop 16, Lisa, you brought up 16. I think that is kind of, I think it kind of shocked us all, to be honest with you, when the PPIC poll came out a couple of months ago. You know, after all that we went through this summer, you thought that the repeal of Prop 209 and the affirmative action measure would be doing really well. And the PPIC numbers came back, and wow, I mean, you know, it was only tested in the 30%. So, you know, at least I felt shocked at that point.
Yeah.
So it's going to be an interesting read in what that means for California and how we examine this. So again, happy to talk any specifics, but.
Thank you. Ken, I'm curious about your thoughts, and you know, it's such a unique factor that we have in California with ballot initiatives and the ballot box, the ability of Californians to institute policy and budget impacts via ballot initiative. What are your thoughts on some of these landmark, potential landmark issues that we're facing with our ballot initiatives this year?
Yeah, so California is one of 24 states that has some form of the initiative process. So half the states have it, half don't. And California's used it more in terms of numbers and impact than any other state. Also, if you go back a generation or so to the 70s, 80s, 90s, that it was the perception that the representative government, the legislature, was skewed to the left of the electorate, and that the electorate using the initiative process was more conservative. And so that's why you saw many ballot measures adopted in the 70s, 80s, and 90s that were essentially more conservative than what the legislature would have done. And one of those is Prop 13 from 1978. Another one is Prop 209 from 1996. And so we're in a situation now where the legislature is hoping that the electorate has moved far enough to the left to undo some of those more conservative ballot measures from a generation or so ago. And they can't just undo Prop 13 or undo 209 through a vote of the legislature. They need to go back to the voters. That's one of the features of the initiative process, is that it locks in these measures until the voters have a chance to vote on them again. And so, you know, it's a real test of what the limits of the shift in California to the left are. As you said, it's surprising that, especially this year, that the repeal of 209 doesn't seem to be polling well and may fail to a significant degree. So we could talk more about why that is so. It seems like a lot of the electorate is concerned about they may be progressive generally, but they also have very particularistic concerns about the admission of their kids to the University of California. And so if you see polling, I think IGS, Institute of Governmental Studies at Berkeley, came out with a poll just very recently,
yeah.
In the crosstab showing that Asian voters are strongly opposed to Prop 16. Non-Hispanic white voters also. African Americans support it. Hispanics are basically split on it, which is interesting to see. And then the Prop 15 has been, especially labor unions, public sector unions, and Democrats generally have wanted to have a split roll initiative to undo half of Prop 13, basically the commercial property part of it. And it'll be extremely interesting to see whether that passes. The polling on it is very close, and it'll have major implications for the business community, which we can talk more about. But I guess the big picture question at this moment of the development of California politics is how far has the electorate moved to the left on some of these issues that have been defining issues for California a generation ago on the more conservative side.
Lisa, you're on mute now.
Oh, sorry. I'm getting some questions through the chat function on the platform here about the potential for civil unrest after the election. And I'm curious what thoughts you all might have on, are those threats real? We're seeing, people talking about putting out the National Guard in certain areas. We're seeing threats from, militant groups within the U.S. who are saying they're going to shoot people standing in line at polling areas. And I'm curious what your thoughts are. Sherry, why don't you lead us on that topic?
Lisa, this is something that's been concerning to me for quite some time. And I'd say it's not only after the election, but there's the potential for unrest at the ballot box on election day in Philadelphia, for example. It is legal to take a gun into a polling place. And there are indications that some protesters, don't know what side for sure, will show up to watch the balloting with a gun strapped on their shoulders. The angst and the weirdness of the behavior of the American public today, it leads me to believe that somewhere out there is someone who is going to do something really horrendous. And certainly after the election, if indeed, as you know, neither the president nor the vice president has indicated that they would flat out say, sure, there will be a quiet transfer of power. That may well mean assuming one result rather than another, that you're going to see militias from one side or another out there doing, and I hate to say it, but out there engaging in public disturbance. I don't know how at this point in time in our political life, given this political environment that we're in, given the extreme polarization out there, given the distrust of institutions, given the distrust of our fellow Americans, we can avoid that match being struck. And the question will be how far the fire goes.
Anyone else have thoughts on this idea, these topics? Okay. I'm also getting some questions about the role of Black and Latino voters. We've touched on it a little bit. And I know that Mindy, in your opening statement, you talked about the, historical figures of who's actually voting more or less historically. Do you think that some of those voters are going to be motivated given, just the issues that we've seen over the civil unrest during the summer, and the concerns with the anti-immigrant rhetoric and all of the things that have been happening? Do you think that's motivating people to vote more? Do you think people are scared because of the intimidation and the threats that we're seeing, particularly against people of color? And we did talk a little bit about whether or not it's going to keep people engaged in the long term. So I'm curious, what are some of the thoughts? Mindy, do you want to start there?
Sure. I definitely think, as you laid them out, all of those are factors in what we think will be. I mean, even before seeing the recent actual numbers of high numbers of ballots being cast, just going into this election for months and months, we've have assumed and have expected a high turnout rate. We've wondered what COVID could do and how that could challenge things, particularly for underrepresented communities that need a lot of in-person contact to get them out to vote. But we've expected high turnout. But I think there's lots of other factors that are in play in terms of all of these numbers. And if we look at 2016, many of the states that were close margin states, I don't think of the swing states, but close margin in the end. We saw, communities of color, reduced turnout. Florida, for instance, in 2012, we saw, which is incredibly unusual, but for Florida, we haven't come close to this in California, but the Latino vote and the white vote was essentially the same. This is by current population survey data from the census. In 2016, Latino vote went down significantly. I believe it was about 7 percentage points, and the white vote went up a little bit, just a tiny bit, but went up. So this is a different election though, because people, if folks are concerned, folks are nervous, of course. They are mobilized. They've lived under, if they don't like Trump's policies, not everybody, right? Depends on where you are on the spectrum. But if you don't like Trump's policies, you've lived them, right, for 4 years. And so I think there is a lot of what we're seeing today, a lot of enthusiasm, if not for Biden, then enthusiasm against Trump and deep concern about, wanting to cast that ballot and have a say and have some sense of control. But at the same time, again, when the dust settles and we count all the numbers, we'll have to see what motivation is there also for Republicans as well. I think there's the overall larger media coverage, all those sorts of things can play into higher turnout, even aside from what's happening with the candidates at the top of the ticket. I just want to emphasize that too.
Lisa?
Yes,
so,
Matt.
A couple things on that. I think that, one, if you look, I don't know as much about the rest of the electorate as I do about California, but I can tell you of the votes that are cast right now, it's overwhelmingly almost 2/3 white in California. It's more than half of the ballots are 55 years of age or older. And 18 to 24-year-olds, only 6.7%. African Americans are 3.2. Latinos are below 20, and yet they are the largest, numerical or percentage share of the population. So the electorate in California is looking older and whiter. I can tell you in other states that, for example, Stacey Abrams' group in Georgia, Fair Fight Action, they've done a fantastic job at registering African American voters. And I know that there are, similar efforts with Latino voters across the Southwest in particular. I tend to look at this positively, though, that voting is a habit-forming behavior. And the more new voters that we get out and vote in 2020, the odds are that these are people that are going to continue voting thereafter. So I don't necessarily think that we're always going to get 85% turnout for elections on a going forward basis, but I'm hoping that we're not going to have 55% turnout on a going forward basis either. So there's a lot of positives that, result with a controversial incumbent president seeking re-election. And I think that is definitely one of them, is that it has encouraged people to make their voice heard by casting their ballot. But I do think, look, in California, anybody who doesn't know what's going on in California, it's not that they're not paying attention, they're choosing to not vote at this point. So, that's a conscious choice. So I think that those people, whatever their party affiliation or age or race or whatever other characteristic, they're making their decision for whatever reason, and that's their choice. But let's focus on educating as many people as possible and getting them to turn out. But it's scary to me that we're still two-thirds white voters and older white voters in California, when people like me and a lot of us on this panel, we're not the majority in the state.
No, that's true, and it's somewhat disappointing, just given the fact that I've never seen such a voter turnout effort across the board where everybody's been encouraging people to vote. Mindy, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say something, and I'm sure Matt knows this too. So at this point, the early vote we would expect to be skewed white and older. Latinos historically vote, they vote in lower numbers, period, lower proportions, lower turnout rates than whites, and younger, lower turnout rates than older voters. We know that's a constant. The only question in any given election is, do those gaps, those disparities in turnout by race, ethnicity, do they narrow a little bit or widen a little bit? The same thing for this election. I think everybody's going to have higher turnout. The question is, do Latinos, do historically underrepresented groups keep pace? So does everybody increase, but the gaps stay about the same? Or do they actually narrow the gaps? And could we actually see some pretty significant narrowing? There's a limit because disparities in turnout are entrenched in our society, which I could talk more about. So I am concerned that we're not seeing higher numbers at this point for Latinos, and younger voters are starting to turn that corner a little bit in California. But again, it's still really early, and this is somewhat par for the course. We have to see what things look like for the rest of the early voting period and certainly on election day. I want to emphasize that. And please,
Tom?
Yeah. I have some thoughts on this turnout, and we've been looking at it really, really closely, for over a year now. And a couple of things, and I disagree with you, Matt, on one aspect. I think that there's still a lot more education that needs to be done in communities about how to vote. I think that developing a plan on how you vote, these ballots can be intimidating. We're talking about 12 ballot measures. We're talking local elections. We're talking all of these different things. And if it were just, I got my little piece of paper and it's Trump or Biden, that would be kind of easy. But this is all kind of intimidating, right? So I think there needs to be more education, continue that. But ultimately, turnout is about energy. There's a reason why Barack Obama was on the ballot and we had 79% turnout. He motivated people to turn out. You can do all the education you want all the time, but when people are motivated is when they turn out. And right now, I read a fascinating article yesterday about intensity. When we look at surveys, we look at intensity, and there lacks an intensity for Biden. The intensity is against Trump, but there's not an intensity for Biden. And Trump voters, by the way, are intense. A Trump voter is intense. I guarantee you, if you find a Trump voter, they're going to find a way to vote on election day. Now they skew whiter and older and all those things too, right? But they're motivated to do it. So I feel like part of this also is give us candidates that motivate us, right? That's the goal. Is when candidates motivate you, you're going to find a way. And I do think, though, I think that's what we have to try and do, is just get this. I want to turn out 85% every time, because Matt and I make more money that way.
Know it, baby.
I'd like to add just one more thing. I think there's an unusual, unique, and I'd like to hear what the campaign folks think about this, a unique opportunity in this election with so many voters voting early, right? When we know voter votes early, if you're in a campaign, not as an academic, but you check off the box. You don't have to spend any resources to track down that voter and call them and try to get them out to vote, right? So as we get to election day, presumably we're gonna have a bigger pile of voters, period. As we get to election day and all of those really likely voters we assume a good chunk of them are all gone, they're done. They're not gone. Yeah. That sounds like they passed on. They're done. That means if a candidate or campaign is motivated, and that's a big if, because it's based on your own political strategic calculations. But if you want to pursue more voters, right, some of the infrequent or new voters that often you're not targeting because of resources, you're trying to get the folks that are going to vote out, vote for you if you call them up. There's an opportunity to reach out to those folks if there's more time, and that also can help in terms of seeing an even greater turnout. I will say, forgive me, Matt, I just want to challenge one thing. The word choose, it's not for many voters, period, potential voters, but particularly from historically underrepresented groups. It's not about a choice, right? There's reasons why people vote, why they don't vote, reasons why voters want to vote, but they abstain because they feel like they don't have enough information. They're confused by the information. They haven't been reached out to candidates or mobilized, all the things that you guys do because it works. Latinos, for instance, we have lots of research that shows us that they even registered are very much less likely to get contacted from a campaign or an issue group or even a nonprofit, a nonpartisan get out the vote campaign. So, and that has a difference, and it makes an impact in terms of their turnout rate. So I just want to emphasize that the mobilization that's needed surpasses any idea of choose or not choose. And there's historical factors and current factors and barriers that make all of that complicated and a challenge to get voters out to participate, who may very well want to participate if they were contacted. Sorry, please, Sherry.
Yeah, Sherry, you're on mute though. You're on mute. You're still on mute.
Loving it.
We can't hear you, Sherry.
It's my turn.
It was your turn and you didn't turn on your mic, girl.
I had my finger on the little mouse and duh. Anyway, Matt did it, actually. He cut me off. Anyway, can you hear me?
We can hear you now. Go, girl.
I was just saying, Mindy sort of touched on this, but we haven't really even mentioned that sometimes it's voter suppression, not choice, that prevents, does not allow people to vote. We haven't talked about that. We've talked about outside other mechanical influences, but yeah, it's not always a choice. Mindy's absolutely right. And the horror of it is that at least some of it, if not a majority of those who don't choose to vote, don't vote because of voter suppression.
Ken, I don't know if you've seen any research on this, but I'm curious, Mindy or Ken, from our academics, about voter suppression in general. So, you know, what are the tactics? Are we just learning more about them? Because I know it's always existed, but are the tactics more aggressive this time around? Are we just knowing more about it because there's more daylight being shed into the issue? Is there a change, or is this just a bunch of hype? And what is the impact going to be?
I'll let Ken jump in because we talked a lot.
Go ahead. Yeah. Well, okay. I'll just say a couple of things. I would say the issue is different in different jurisdictions. California, over the last decade and more, has done a lot to make it easier to vote, and is much more attentive to the issues of voter access and suppression than many other states. It is a priority of this legislature to improve the chances of people to vote. Other jurisdictions have different political traditions or motivations or whatever, and make it more difficult to vote in general, in terms of how to register, whether there's opportunity for pre-election voting, provisional voting, all that kind of stuff. And so some of the more traditionalistic states, you could say, in the South and other places, we can think about what the motivations for that all might be. But I would say California is not at the top of the list when it comes to those kinds of concerns or considerations.
I would agree. I'll just add that when we say voter suppression, often it means different things to different people. And, you know, I mentioned a second ago, kind of blurting out, but, you know, it's overt or not so overt, right? So I think many people will think of voter suppression the days, you know, days in the prior to the Civil Rights Act or Voting Rights Act, you know, where we see images of people literally being physically beat up if they're trying to vote, right? Or things like poll taxes and literacy tests and those sorts of things. People can still be physically intimidated. There still can be communities, even here in California, that have experienced in recent elections, you know, sheriffs near intimidating, you know, sheriffs near polling places and so forth. And certainly across the country, you know, we know these things still exist. California has come a long way in terms of, so the other type of voter suppression is instead of the overt where we think about, you know, something physical, right? And with racist language and so forth around it, it's just a system of electoral rules, right? That are designed in a way to disproportionately disadvantage voters of color, historically underrepresented groups. Usually there's a partisan, often angle to this, but Democrats and Republicans both historically have done it. And California has, you know, we in California, when we talk about election reforms, we mean opening up access. And we've done a lot of that in the last few years. So reforms like online voter registration and automatic voter registration and same-day voter registration and, you know, expanding vote by mail. In other parts of the country, when you talk about election reforms, they're talking about things like voter fraud and protecting the vote from millions of illegal aliens or whatever it might be, right? And so instituting things like, with all due respect as I say that, but that is actually rhetoric we've heard from the president and others. And then we see things like voter ID laws, which are designed, or at least, you know, overtly around protecting somebody's vote, right? Not making sure that your vote is not diluted by people who aren't allowed to vote. But those disproportionately impact, like in Texas, right? Not allowing student IDs to be considered valid, right, for voting. So We have seen a push in the last 10 years that has been an overtly partisan, right, on the part of Republicans. And with the gutting of the Voting Rights Act with the Shelby decision from the Supreme Court in 2013, really just that effort going on overdrive. And it was aided by, of course, the increase in Republican-led legislatures, if I can say the word. So kind of all things coming together to allow that. So I think we're hearing a lot about it because we've been seeing a lot about it. And of course, a lot of challenge at the Supreme Court level in terms of those types of things, you know, and then overt cases like Virginia, where the legislature literally asked for data on African-Americans and what would affect African-Americans' early voting patterns and so forth. So, but it happens very overtly, in much more subtle ways, and it's woven into the law. And it's something we still have to think about. And then lastly, I would argue voter suppression also, if we think about how to define it, that umbrella, it's also, aside from the election laws that we have in this country, it's how we talk about the election. It's how we talk about voting. It's the ways we encourage or discourage groups to participate. Very much for young people, it's very overt still to this day, where we talk a lot of good talk, but we don't, you know, it's completely socially acceptable for young people not to participate. We often discourage them in many ways. Family members, older voters will say, you know, make sure they know what they're doing first, or they're paying taxes, that sort of thing. Phrases like the sleeping giant for Latinos actually serves to kind of blame the victim, calling young people apathetic and they don't care about voting, when of course they do, but there's lots of reasons why they don't participate, including us not giving them the tools in school. And we blame the victim, and it actually, and so to speak, and it actually ends up a form of suppression, right? And the lack of campaign contact, the lack of issues that historically underrepresented groups care about being discussed in a campaign, that kind of perpetuation over time. And of course, you know, historic marginalization that makes a bigger case for historically underrepresented groups to make the leap into voting, and wondering, you know, why it really matters if I'm not hearing or seeing anything different in this election. So I just, to me, those kind of three buckets are all part of voter suppression, and we need to be talking about all of that if we really want to see the needle change and have more of a representative electorate.
We're heading into the last 10 minutes of our conversation, and I want to make sure that we get the final word and any predictions from each of our panelists here. So I asked Tom to go first last time, and I will close with Tom going first. What's your big prediction? What are your final closing thoughts for us here today?
I think the presidential race is going to be closer than people think. I'm not saying Trump's going to win, but I think that race is going to be a lot closer than people think because of the energy that lives in the Trump world. I think it's on a national level. I think on a state level, you know, I think the highlight is going to be Prop 15 being close, as Ken said, but I think Prop 15 loses. I think that at that point, the public employee unions have really taken their best shot at split roll and an 85% turnout model. And they're going to have a lot of explaining to do to their membership on how they spent $70 million. And they're not going to be able to come back with that for quite a while at that point, because they've taken their best shot at it. So I think those are probably my two big predictions going into Tuesday.
Sherry? Mike? Mic check. Mic check.
I didn't do it.
Again? It was Matt. I have never predicted, and I'm not going to start now, and I don't think I could. I am still suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder from 2016. I have learned never to say never in politics. That's my prediction.
I couldn't agree with you more on that topic. Ken, what are your predictions? And actually, I want you to predict on Texas too, since you're our Texas. Yeah,
I'll turn to that. I mean, I agree with Sherry. Predictions are risky, and I think things are more unstable now than they were, say, 10 years ago. It was easier to sort of understand how the electorate was sorting and where the states were landing, and there's been more fluidity. Sort of deconstruction of things in the last, since Trump, really, basically. And I don't think Texas would have been in play if there'd been a normal Republican on the ballot. That Trump has driven away the sort of an essential element of the Republican coalition, which is educated suburban voters, middle class, upper middle class, who are now just alienated from Trump and his rhetoric and such. And that's a big part of where the bleeding is happening in Texas for Republicans. It's in the suburbs of Dallas and Houston and those kinds of places where Republicans are really seeing significant losses. They lost some House seats in 2018. There's some other ones that are in play this time around. There's even some question of whether Republicans will retain control of the lower house of the Texas legislature. I think they probably will. I think this is going to be certainly a big wake-up call in general for Republicans when even a state like Texas, which is an essential part of the Republican coalition, is at risk of being lost. I think probably that Trump will win Texas narrowly, more narrowly than Hillary Clinton did. But it's just, there's a shift. And Arizona is a state which has been historically, a rock solid Republican state, and it's going Democratic, right? And so Republicans in general, I think my prediction will be that the Trump will lose the general election, and there's going to be sort of a major postmortem going on for the Republican Party about where to go from here.
Again,
Matt, I was going to say, Matt, why don't you, because I'm sure you want to follow on the issues of, what is the postmortem going to be? As you give us your closing thoughts and your predictions, I think it's also interesting to know, what is the postmortem for each of the parties going to be after this crazy election cycle?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Real quickly, predictions. I think that I agree with Tom that the presidential race is a lot closer than I think that Biden ultimately wins. I think we won't know that though, probably until mid-November-ish, hopefully before Thanksgiving. I think what's going to be fascinating is that there are two Senate races in Georgia. The second race, which is the Kelly Loeffler, Doug Collins race, the Democrat will actually finish first in that race because the Republican vote will be divided. And then they go to an early December runoff. I think that the Senate is going to be really close. I think that right now the Democrats will take it, but if it's a one vote swing, that race is going to be really, really interesting. And I think that will be a fun one to watch because cumulatively the Republicans minus Trump are stronger in Texas as they are in Georgia. I think, look, postmortem on this, I think that, so I don't think like the Lincoln Project, I don't see how those folks can ever come back into the Republican Party again. But that being said, I think that the party of the Republican Party and the party of Trump that are linked right now, it was a marriage of convenience. And, look, slashing regulations, 200 plus federal judges and 3 Supreme Court justices, that's a pretty good trade. And I think that they, as most parties do when they lose, they look inward. And the Republican Party will have a lot of soul searching to do, as will the Democrats, because if the Democrats run the show, they're not the thing that unites the coalition against Donald or for Joe Biden is hatred of Donald Trump. With that boogeyman gone, there's a lot of disparate influences in the Democratic Party. So we're by no means out of the woods if Trump is behind us, but it makes it exciting for folks like Tom and for me, and it gives Sherry a lot of content to talk about on TV.
All right, Mindy, take us home. What are your final thoughts for us here today?
I was going to say, I'm not going to make a prediction, although I do think it's going to be a lot closer. I agree with both. I think Ken and Matt. And I think there's going to be a postmortem necessary period for both parties without the boogeyman of Donald Trump. you know, but I do think that, I'm just thinking, I'm reacting to some of your comments. I think the Lincoln Project people are not going to necessarily be outcast. And I do think that history on Trump will evolve very, very quickly. At the time when Nixon, not to completely equate them, of course, Nixon was asked to resign. He still had a huge support. He just went through an election and won. He had a lot of support from the American people. And now we universally in our history books, right, teach our kids that he was, you know, all of the terrible things that he did. And in Republican and Democratic circles, essentially, we can talk about who he is pretty openly. I think if Trump loses this election, that process will be a lot faster. And we know a lot within the Republican Party who have been privately very dismayed, very concerned, very, you know, just add every adjective you want in there, and will breathe a sigh of relief once the political fallout goes away, because that's going to be there no matter what. That they will look for reform within their own party, and I think there's room for leadership for those people that took a stand now to go forward in the Republican Party. We'll see what happens. I don't think it's going to be easy by any means, but I'm just saying I think that the tide will turn against Trump in terms of, you know, what we've seen now in terms of support within the Republican Party for him is simply purely strategic political calculation, right, for those individual members. And then, you know, I'm waiting to see what is going to happen with historically underrepresented groups. Typically, when we have really high turnout, it also means not just turnout for everybody, but a closing of the gap in those disparities. We'll have to see what happens. If we do have an electorate that is more representative, that's going to be so incredibly exciting. And then the challenge is, how do we keep that? As Matt said, I don't think that it's a guarantee by any means, because we always see ups and downs in elections in terms of high points and lower points. The challenge is to keep those people that came into the electorate, many of them motivated by Trump, but not all, to talk about issues that they care about going forward and not to be about one particular candidate. And can we have more robust democracy after all of the dust settles? But again, like with my opening statement, I think we're going to be fighting all of the distrust and misinformation and polarization and all of that crud. I was going to swear, sorry. So, you know, we're going to have that reality, but we could, you know, still we're going to hopefully have really, really incredibly high turnout. How can we somehow get to 2022 and 2024 and keep those folks motivated, despite what, you know, what will surely be lingering levels of distrust and disillusionment. So that means all of our civic leaders, our community leaders, trusted messengers are going to all have to play a role in, you know, tying back up our democracy, you know, all the phrase at the end, right, that we've been seeing, and the tears that we currently have. We're all going to have to do some work with that.
Thank you. I'm sure, as I have enjoyed this conversation, I'm sure that our 130 attendees who joined us here this morning have enjoyed, yeah, see Matt, this amazing group of people who clearly have devoted a lot of time, energy, and brain power to understanding what is seemingly complex and increasingly confusing voter and ballot initiatives and all the things that we're dealing with. And so I want to just give a big round of virtual applause to our panelists here today. I'm hoping you'll be able to see some of them on your local TV or radio on election night. Matt and Sherry, will you be? And Mindy, if you guys will be out there, please put in the chat where our folks can find you so they can continue to enjoy your insights on the election. We are so grateful to Klink Campaigns for sponsoring today's panel and our presenting sponsors for the entire Business Forecast Conference, SoCal Gas and Wells Fargo. Don't forget to visit the raffle page to find out how to enter the raffle, and visit our exhibitors. You won't be able to participate in the raffle if you don't visit all the exhibitors. So now we're going to take about a 20-minute break, bio break for those of you who may need it. And you'll have some time to visit the booths. And I just want to thank this group of folks. It's been an absolute pleasure to be able to try to herd these cats. And I've really enjoyed this conversation. And to everyone out there, stay safe, stay healthy, stay sane to the extent that it's possible. And so thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone. Thank you.